welcome to the Agile Coaching Exchange. It is November 2021. We're really pleased to see so many of you tonight. Our speaker tonight is Grant Smith, who's a prolific DevOps engineer and professional in IT and technology. His career spans around 20 years, and for the last 10 years, he's been helping drive that collaboration between development and operations through the wonderful world of DevOps. His client base is very broad, and at the moment, he's working with 101 Ways, who I'm also doing some work with at the moment. And even there, he's covering a span of clients from retail to media to travel. He's got lots of experience in lots of different areas of technology and uses of this amazing tool for collaboration. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Grant tonight and give the floor to him. So please give Grant a virtual round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thanks for the intro, Ben. So good evening, everyone. Obviously, I'm Grant Smith. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes tonight, and then we're going to open it up to the fun bit where we get to your questions, which is the bit I'm really looking forward to. I'm going to give you a brief history lesson on DevOps, because I think it's quite illuminating to reflect on the situations that gave rise to DevOps in the first place. And it's useful to understand some of the motivations and agendas that have sort of shaped the movement over the last kind of decade and a bit that it's been around. I'll then discuss the sort of more modern trends. So I'll talk a little bit about how DevOps differs from SRE and a little bit about the reality of how those are showing up in companies at the moment. Hopefully you'll recognize some of the sort of patterns that I talk about there. I'll share a few stories, obviously, from my recent experiences, and then talk a little bit about where DevOps is going, I think. I'm going to be brief because, as I said, what I really want to get to is your questions. That's the sort of fun bit, but this is really kind of the warm-up act to that, if you think of it that way. So first, let me tell you a little bit about me and my background and how I kind of got into this stuff, because, again, I think that might help. So I started working in technology in the late 90s for AOL, where I met James. And back then, in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, working for AOL, I was running the busiest websites in Europe at the time. So I didn't start small. I never built servers manually. At AOL, we had really slick processes for buying hardware, getting it built. Not stuff I built. I was still very junior at that time. I was sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, but we didn't do anything small scale back then. For the 90s, obviously, you know, modern standards change and all the rest of it. But what that meant was, while we didn't call it infrastructure as code or CI/CD, we definitely had some tools for building lots of servers at once and for deploying applications to lots of servers at the same time and for doing rolling restarts and all those kinds of things that are, you know, sort of the DevOps fashion. These are things we were doing back in the sort of 90s, early 2000s. And it was similar to DevOps. As I say, the tools were a little bit hacky, but they did work. And we had something that, as I say, looked like DevOps. So roll on a couple of years to sort of 2003, AOL engaged ThoughtWorks to help us shift to Agile. So again, we were a sort of early adopter of Agile back then as well. And we were running a big project, and I was running the ops team at the time. And we were a little frozen out of the process because ThoughtWorks and our bosses were very much focused on the development teams and not so much on the operations teams. But I'm not one to sit around and get snubbed, at least not for long. And I discovered a very small movement called Extreme Ops that gave me my into Agile development. When the time came to launch that application and get it into production, I persuaded a couple of the ThoughtWorks guys to work with us to fully script the deployment of the application into production. We had been running continuous build already for the sort of 18 months before that big launch. And then we had continuous deployment. And that was back in 2004. So again, I got a bit of a head start on DevOps. Now, those ThoughtWorks guys, if any of you sort of follow the DevOps space, you might have heard of them, Jez Humble and Dan North. They've both made their names in consulting on DevOps. I think Jez is a sociology professor now off the back of that, but that's up to him. But all of us from that first team have kind of, you know, moved on and sort of really been leading in the industry a little bit. So let me fast forward a little bit to 2009, which is where the term DevOps sort of first originated and was official. And it was really started by a guy called Patrick Dubois. Patrick is an unusual dude, if you ever meet him. He's a computer science graduate. He's worked as a developer. Back then, he had an ambition to really understand the whole technology industry. And as a result, he wanted to work in all of the roles in technology. So he did his dev time. He joined an ops team and worked in an ops team for a little while. And then he decided he was going to take on a testing role. So he was a tester on a Belgian government project to do a data center migration. That project went the way most of these sorts of projects do. I imagine some of you have run data center migration projects, and you'll sort of be familiar with the story a little bit, which was that for the most part, everything was fine. The biggest problems were really logistics and getting things stood up in the new data center until he got to the last few servers, and no one knew what they did. Patrick was comfortable with the operations teams and the roles, so he went and spoke to the ops team. They all had instructions about how to restart these things and how to monitor the process on them, but they didn't know what they did. So Patrick went to the developers to see if he could look at the source code and see what these applications were doing, but the source code was lost, had been lost in a previous source code migration project. And so he did some forensics. He got access to those boxes, figured out what they did, figured out who they were doing it for, understood what those applications were, got them moved, and then obviously as a tester built the tests to get those tested in the new data center. And that experience really showed him that keeping the development, the operations, and the testing skills separated wasn't practical for modern online applications. Off the back of that experience, he ran the first DevOps conference in 2009 and found a very receptive audience, initially mostly in America, but it kind of caught on quickly. For a few years, we went through that phase of, what's DevOps and what's DevOps mean to you and all that kind of stuff, and it got very boring. And then in 2012, an influential group of engineers who didn't want to be responsible for running applications in the live environment tried to rebrand DevOps as just the CI/CD pipeline. That's when I really got active in this space, because that annoyed me a bit. My response was, out of my rage, I wrote a book, and people like me and my book and my part in that was to really define DevOps as a holistic approach to building, managing, launching applications into production, encompassing the full software development lifecycle from first line of code through to running in live, all the way through to decommissioning. For the most part, I think we've won that argument. That's certainly the model I see adopted more and more these days. So that brings us now to 2016. When the next major sort of event happened in the sort of DevOps movement, which is Google publishing their site reliability engineering book. For those of you who haven't read it, I don't blame you, it's kind of dry. It's really a series of compiled essays. There's some good stuff in there, like I say, just a little dry. The problem with our industry is that we have a tendency to fall into cargo cults. If it's right for Google, then it must be right for the rest of us, which is not true. It's worth bearing in mind, as if you read that book or if you talk to anyone about that book, there are problems Google face that nobody else faces. What would be a minor inconvenience for a medium-sized business is tens of millions of dollars to Google, which means they invest in things the rest of us would never bother it, because to us it costs us 10 grand. To them, it's a fortune. And that's you've always got to bear that in mind whenever you're thinking about SRE and about Google's perspective on DevOps and that kind of stuff. What Google outlined in that book is that the difference between SRE and DevOps is that SRE teams build products which application teams use to publish their applications. So in the most basic use case, this will be something like a CI/CD pipeline that they offer as a product, as opposed to as a capability or as a service like DevOps might do. So where DevOps is a bunch of multi-skilled engineers working together to build, launch, and manage an application, an SRE team build products for application developers to use to build, launch, and manage their applications in production. It's a subtle distinction, but it has large implications. SRE relies on most of the application development teams in the organization to standardize their technology. Otherwise, you can't build a product that can work for all of those use cases. The best example I can give you of this is from Google. One of their SRE teams capitalized on all of the Google application development teams using containers, and so they built Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a really complex platform as a service product that allows Google to make very efficient use of all of its hardware. by automating the management of where Google deploys its containers that make up its products. As I said, that's not a problem most people face because most people don't have tens of thousands of machines running millions of containers. You know, most people are talking about a handful, half a dozen, you know, maybe 100 or 400 microservices or 1,000 even at a push, but still nothing like the kind of volume that Google are talking about. So that's DevOps and SRE and where we've come from. So let me talk a little bit now about what I'm seeing in the industry at the moment. And that is a compromise between those two positions, between SRE and DevOps. So increasingly, application teams are responsible for their applications in production. They don't always have the skills to do it, but they are encouraged to develop them. There usually are SRE teams, although that term's still gaining popularity, so they might be called something else, but they're sort of centralized teams fulfilling that kind of function. These teams will be accountable for reporting on and managing cloud spend, so they usually develop account management, tagging, cloud optimization type toolkits or tool sets that they use to make sure costs can be allocated to teams and projects and that kind of stuff. These SRE teams will also manage the edge of the network, the caching layers, other sort of common components that are sort of common throughout the estate. And they'll sometimes provide these as products to the applications teams, or sometimes they just sort of provide it as a service. And the difference in that case is a product really sort of enables you to self-serve, whereas, you know, a capability of service means you have to come begging to me and then I make the change you need. And that's sort of really the big sort of difference between SRE and sort of DevOps type solutions. So as well as those kinds of things, they'll often run source code management, monitoring and logging solutions. Those require a small degree of standardization, but usually not too difficult to negotiate. If there's sufficient technology standardization across the org, they can provide CI/CD, secrets management, artifact management, and even application performance management tools. Most medium-sized organizations have now moved away from running virtual machines and will be deploying containerized or serverless applications, meaning there isn't as much need for products like infrastructure provisioning, environment configuration, configuration management. However, if your organization is still using VMs, you'll probably need some sort of capability in that space as well. The implications of all this is that from company to company, there's a wide variation in the different accountabilities of application development teams and centralized functions. This makes life difficult for everyone. For software engineers, they're required to be experts in a huge range of technologies. Not only that, but a lot of those technologies require a significant amount of decisions to be made in order to use them. Let's take secrets management as an example. So a secret is a password or a secret API key, something that you need in order to get something to run. So the team we're talking about, they've decided they're going to use GitHub Actions for their CI/CD pipeline. The GitHub runner that's going to execute all of the tasks in that pipeline needs permissions to access all the things that it needs to run and build and launch this application and build the servers and deploy onto it and all that kind of stuff. If I put those secrets in the source code where, you know, the GitHub runner can get at them, security will execute me on the spot or I'll get hacked. Either way, it's not a viable solution. We can't really do that these days. So I decide I'm going to use a secrets management solution. Okay, all the major clouds have them. So AWS, Azure, GCP, they all have secrets management solutions. So that's fine. I can call in that service and I can build that, assuming I get access to do that. So I've got my secrets management solution. I need to stash my secrets. So secrets are essentially a key value pair, right? So the value is the secret itself, the password, the API key, whatever. And the key is what I call it, the name of it, so I can go access it and use it. So what do I call it? Well, let's say I'm trying to get the New Relic agent to run so I can monitor my application, right? So I want to get that deployed onto my, as a sidecar container or something else. So maybe I call that new_relic_agent, but I'm probably going to have production and non-production, right? So new_relic_prod agent and non-prod agent. Or maybe I should call out my application name. So if somebody's reading the code, they can see that it's my application that's using that secret and everyone knows what it is. And we're going to have to go through that process for every single secret that we're talking about. So if I'm in a medium-sized business and I need some sort of standards and conventions for this kind of stuff, I got to talk to 10 or up to 100 teams to talk to them to try and establish the conventions I have so that we can all store our secrets and everyone knows how to do it. All the while, I've got product managers beating down my neck to actually build this application and not fanny around with secrets. So that's sort of some of the difficulty that we face with with just knowing that certain solutions even exist, to understand when to use one tool versus another or a service or whatever, to understanding common pitfalls of a particular approach, to then being able to form a strong opinion about how that tool should be used so it can be productionized. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a backlash in our industry at the moment against architects and sort of architecture in general, and for good reasons in some cases, but it means that organizations are sometimes rudderless when it comes to making these sorts of decisions. This is often, as a consultant, some of the things I get called in to help people do. More and more I see organizations embracing the concept of sort of principal engineers or fellows, but that's not a well-defined role, and there's a lot of variation there. So that's where we stand at the moment. We have this concept of SRE, this idea of DevOps in teams already. The world's a complex place. There's a lot of tools we've got to try and use. Standardization isn't an easy thing to achieve, and so it isn't easy to develop those products because a lot of consensus we have to get, and we don't have the kind of leadership often that drives towards that consensus. And so we are in a world where we're having to use complex tools and clouds and what have you, and we don't necessarily have the guidance needed to be able to do that. So let me take the next few minutes of your time to talk about where we're going next. First of all, as you can see from that sequence management example, we're still very much in a transition state. We don't yet have the mature enough tools to allow developers to build, launch, and manage their applications easily. Most companies have abandoned the idea of an old school ops team that's responsible for reliability. That responsibility now tends to reside with the application development teams themselves, but they don't necessarily have all the tools and skills they need to be able to do that. Most companies won't budget sufficiently to allow an SRE team to be large enough to provide the kind of high quality products that application dev teams would need to be successful, nor will they force the degree of standardization needed to be able to build those products quickly. This means we still have situations where those centralized teams can block application development due to a lack of capability, people, standardization, and/or time in that regard. The industry, and by this I mean the sort of cloud providers, major software vendors, they are aware of this. They know this is happening and they're designing for it accordingly. So there's really sort of two ways that's going. The major cloud providers and other major software vendors and system integrators and stuff, they are building solutions that allow these centralized teams to be able to run this stuff and to be able to sort of assign complex permissions to app teams so they can provide these functions and try and get out of their way and let the app teams have the freedom they need to do their stuff. We're seeing that, as I say, in all the major clouds, but also a lot of the enterprise tooling like New Relic and App Dynamics and all those kinds of things. There's another angle that's being taken, and this is a much smaller movement, but some of the developers who hit these problems, back in the sort of 2010s and stuff, frustrated with that world, have started building a sort of new range of kind of platform as a service type applications designed to run on top of all those clouds, but by forcing a bunch of opinions and constraints on the developers that use those tools, they can vastly simplify that process of building and publishing those applications. Ironically, the constraints the developers have to accept from those services are often much more extreme than those requested by the centralized teams, but it's always more pleasant to be able to choose your constraints rather than have them forced on you. So I kind of understand how that works. An example of this sort of service is something called Vercel. Vercel is an application that was, or a service really, that was built by the people who built Next.js. If you're building a React application using Next.js, something like Vercel can make it very easy to deploy and publish your application. You don't even really need to have any understanding of the cloud you're on. So Vercel, I think, typically runs on AWS, but I think it runs on other clouds as well. But the team building and deploying wouldn't even necessarily need that sort of AWS knowledge. Vercel's opinions and constraints would kind of take care of that for you. So I see that trend expanding, not just into kind of web apps like React, like the one I talked about, but this is getting into the data space. So we're seeing increasingly sophisticated tools like this in machine learning and big data processing. So if you look at Amazon's new services like Forecast, again, designed to build on top of their data warehouse solution, Redshift, and on top of their sort of data pipeline solution, you can now build simple machine learning algorithms. I say simple in terms of they've made it simple to apply to your data. So again, you don't need that sort of big complex knowledge. So that's also going on in a sort of messaging and event-driven space. So companies like Confluent Cloud, they build a kind of Kafka as a service, which again really makes Kafka, which is a very complex service to build yourself, available to you just as that service. So you've got this enterprisey sort of cloud, sort of middle range kind of solution where centralized teams do the major management of things and sort of allocate permissions to application development teams. Then you've got this other approach where application development teams can choose to use sort of high level services, accept a bunch of constraints, but then get a much sort of smoother run through. And I see that split really happening based on the size and nature of the organization that you're in. So I think I've whittled on for enough now. That's kind of where we've come from, where we are now, and where I think we're going. This is the fun bit. So if you've got any questions, now's the time, if you haven't already been sending them through, which I think you have.
Thanks very much, Grant. So some of you will have noticed I've been spamming the chat channels, and there's a URL for a Slido. So if you haven't already, please go ahead to the Slido and submit your questions there, or upvote the ones that you want to really make sure get answered. So I'm going to go to that link now, and what I'll do, I'll be asking the ones which have got to the top of the popularity list there. Okay, so I'll try my best kind of cross between Michael Parkinson with a little bit of Andrew Marr, but we're all friends here. So let's see. So our first question we've got here, Grant, is if DevOps is a mindset, why do we see so many companies create an organizational structure rather than incorporate the principles into engineering team behavior? That's a long question, that. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good one. It's a good one. So this question sort of reflects the fact that I think I alluded to this a little bit, that in the sort of 2010s, there was lots of, oh, what is DevOps? DevOps is a mindset kind of thing. That battle was won by the recruiters. So the recruiters decided there would be a skill set called DevOps, and they kind of won, right? They sort of forced that on the rest of us. Many of us were having that debate about, no, it's just about us as engineers coming together and understanding those skills of each other and that kind of stuff. The recruiters won that battle. So the reason I think companies are building those teams is a lot because recruiters offered those skills as DevOps skills. I've got friends of mine, you know, guys who absolutely hated that concept that DevOps was a role, but when somebody comes along offering you £700 a day to do that role, it's quite tempting, and principles sort of fall by the wayside a little bit. So really, I think that is recruiter driven, skill set driven, and driven by people who needed stricter definition. If I go to a bank and I say, hey, I need you to adopt this mindset, that's a lot harder than if I say, pay £700 a day and someone will build your pipeline for you. So I think it's just practicality and pragmatism.
Thanks very much. Certainly as an Agile coach, we do see recruitment where any job title with Agile put on the front of it, which doesn't necessarily make it a role, does it? It's just a thing that's been run by the recruiters.
Yeah, I think it's very similar. Obviously, I'm kind of aware of that space as well, and you know, there was a time when if you had Agile in a role, it got you an extra £100 a day, you know, for contract rates, and the same thing happened in DevOps for sure.
Halcyon days. So our next question, what can Agile coaches do to increase or extend their competency to include DevOps?
That is a great question, and I'm going to try and empathize with an Agile coach to get there. So I think the best thing you can do is make friends with someone who knows this stuff. So certainly I've got a few friends in the sort of delivery and the product space who hit me up for advice on this kind of stuff. So that's always a good tactic. The other thing I would do is there's a couple of books that are worth a read. And I think there was a question somewhere about books, so I'll cover this one. There's a great book, and I wish I'd written it, but I didn't, from Gene Kim called The Phoenix Project. And it's a great book because it isn't a dry, boring technical book. I've never finished a technical book in my life. I can't get through an O'Reilly one to save my life, right? But The Phoenix Project is sort of written as a work of fiction to describe a real world scenario, but fictionally. And Gene kind of walks you through the personalities of different types, you know, representing the agendas of people. So the Phoenix Project is a brilliant introduction to what this is all about and what it's trying to achieve. Free also gives me an opportunity to recommend my book, because my book's also awesome. But probably, let me tell you what my book does before I recommend you buy it. So as I said, I got really angry and I wrote my book in response to some changes in the movement. So what my book does is it basically tells a manager how they can move to DevOps. So it assumes that they don't have, you know, a big major strategic initiative, and it assumes they want to sort of, you know, bring more accountability into their team, and it sort of walks you through that. So if you're interested in how would a team adopt DevOps type practices when maybe all around them aren't, my book, Next Gen DevOps, could answer that question. But I totally recommend the Phoenix Project as a great intro to this space.
Thanks very much. Before everyone joined the meetup tonight, I did ask Grant if there was anything that he wanted us to mention, like his book, and I did suggest that maybe he might bring his book into a stage production or something, just add a bit of festive pizzazz, but you did decline that.
I did, thank you. Song and dance is not my forte.
Great. So if there's any other books, there's a question about it later. There might be some other things, but we'll come to that. The next one we have here. Are there any workshops or certifications that may be useful for an Agile coach to seek to pursue to demonstrate his or her competence in the DevOps area?
So that was another thing I got into an argument about at a dinner once. So there was a movement to try to certify DevOps, and a lot of consultancies, some of the early ones like Contino are a specialist sort of DevOps consultancy, or they were. I think they're a bit broader now, but they used to be specialists into DevOps. They were pushing very hard for there to be a sort of DevOps certification. This was sort of back in the days when it was easy to get, you know, a few £100 as a DevOps engineer. None of that's really landed. What a lot of people respect is the AWS certifications. So doing anything in AWS, even the most trivial task, just standing up a single server or whatever, requires a sort of DevOps concept and mindset, right? Because you're programming an interface to build your box, which is, you know, the very core root of DevOps. So I would definitely recommend, if you want to get kind of deep into it, then AWS is the way to go, but that's a reasonably technical set of certifications. What I would suggest is the best thing you can do to get your head around it is, you know, obviously blog articles and meetups like this and that kind of stuff. But as far as certification goes, I think the AWS stuff is the sort of standard, but I think that's probably a bit deep for anybody who isn't doing it as a full-time job.
I think what's really interesting about that answer is, as well, is that you recognize that there's certification in that I am an engineer that is going to have to implement something to do with the DevOps. And then you also have Agile coaches that aren't necessarily going to be doing that implementation. From your point of view and from your experience, what would you say would be the kind of minimum requirements or knowledge that you would expect an Agile coach to have about this field?
That's a great question, and I love it because there is something really practical, I think. The reason DevOps came to be was this conjunction of DevOps and testing needed to get something into life. The best thing you can do is talk to your teams about not just how do you build that application, but how do you launch it? And once you've launched it, how do you know it's working well? That last word is the really important bit. How do you know it's working well? Anyone can tell you a process is running, but how do you know that your customers are getting your web pages served in under X seconds? How do you know that that database query is happening in X 100 milliseconds or whatever it has to be? That conversation you have with your teams about not just how do we build this, but how do we launch it? And that launch process, it's really interesting in terms of launching a modern application can take 10 seconds. Planning it can take 3 weeks. So having some really good understanding of what are those stages, how do we know it's working, how do we know it's working well, how do we know it's working with everything else, and really getting to the bottom of that is at the heart of what DevOps is all about. You've got to run this thing in production. How do you do that? And that was really the kind of, when people en masse started building online applications in the early 2000s, that was everybody's stumbling block. If any of you are gamers, you'll know every single game launch is crap. The reason for that is because, having worked in a games company for a few years, I can tell you exactly why the reason is, because that process of launching that game isn't well planned. It's not capacity managed, because what happens is that games team has spent 2 years building that thing, minimum, then suddenly they surface out of their caves and they go, we got to launch this thing now. And then they spend, you know, a week planning it when they spent 2 years building that thing. And they didn't design the game to be launched. What I mean by that is, when we build a web app, say, these days, we know that Google is our king. If Google don't approve of us, we won't get our web app surfaced. Google have told us that we have to meet the core web vitals in order to meet their SEO search criteria. So we know up front, we're going to plug New Relic in or App Dynamics or any of those tools, and we're going to get those core web vitals, and we're going to be testing that stuff weeks and weeks before launch, because we know that that's key to the successful launch. But in other applications, or banking, or games or what have you, it isn't quite as simple. You know, nobody comes and hands you the magical metrics like we have in web apps, but you've got to figure that stuff out. So that's the key point, is not just how do I launch it, i.e. copy file from place A to place B, but also what's a good launch look like? How do we know we're doing well? I think that's the key. If you can understand that, then you've got most of DevOps under your belt.
I think that's a really good answer. And certainly in the kind of solid coaching field, even further beyond outside Agile, we have this concept of a mental rehearsal where you'll invite your client to kind of imagine that they're going through the thing that they're preparing to, and you know what's happening now, what happens after that, and what will that be like. So I think that really fits in really well with a practical technological application there.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's move on. So this is a good one. What are some common misconceptions about DevOps that you encounter?
Great question, because that gets the blood rising. This doesn't happen as often now, but I still think it happens. That DevOps is just the new name for ops. Having been an ops guy earlier on in my career, I can tell you for sure the two jobs are not the same at all. They're miles apart. But there is a certain technologist type person who persists in just assuming we're doing the same thing that we used to do in the late 90s as we're doing now, and that's not true. So that's one of the preconceptions. DevOps is not just the new word for ops. The other one, again, this was what got me angry in 2012, was that DevOps is just the CI/CD pipeline. As I said, DevOps is not just how you get your application deployed onto some servers. It's how you know it's running well. It's how you manage it through that life cycle, including its changes and all those kinds of things. Those are the two main ones. The other one is that DevOps is what you do at the end of a project. Again, this kind of harkens back a little bit to the old school ops method, where a team happily does whatever they want to do to get this thing built, and then suddenly goes to the end, oh, how do I get it to live? Whereas, the way I build applications, the way I encourage companies I work for, is actually deploy your application to live now. Do it straight away. Why do it in a weird other environment that's not live? Put the thing live. Anything that prevents you from doing that, let's figure it out. Do we put feature flags on it so it doesn't show up to customers, but we can see it? Or do we deploy it somewhere else because we don't mind if customers stumble across it, but we don't need to promote it? Either way, that whole idea of, from the first time you've got a hello world application and your team have got their repo built and they're ready to go, get that thing into live. So it isn't something, DevOps doesn't start once you finish building the thing. DevOps is right through the get-go. So those, I think, are the three main misconceptions that bug me the most.
Great, thank you. So we've come actually back to the question that I think Helen put in, which was about the best book or resource that people could read to get more familiar with DevOps. I mean, you mentioned a couple of books there, but are there any other avenues you can think of that you would recommend?
There's a DevOps newsletter that most DevOps practitioners subscribe to. It's curated by a guy called Gareth, who's been running it for years. So if you just search for the DevOps newsletter, you'll find it. There's probably others, but Gareth's will be at the top, I'm sure. The other thing is there's I can't remember who's sponsoring it now, but there's a report that Jez Humble runs, or his company runs, I think, called The State of DevOps. Used to be sponsored by Puppet. I think it might be sponsored by somebody else now. But if you Google the State of DevOps report, one of the great things it does is they survey a whole bunch of companies anonymously for various metrics. They're called the Dora Metrics, but they'll be included in that report, which really, these 4 Dora Metrics really summarize the difference between an unhealthy and a healthy DevOps process. And the State of DevOps report really helps put it into context. They offer a narrative around what they're seeing as far as trends go, that kind of stuff. So, Gareth's newsletter, the DevOps newsletter, the State of DevOps report, I think those are useful. And obviously anything I write is obviously awesome, and you should totally read that. I don't write as much as I used to these days, but yes, I think those two would be the places I would send you. Particularly if you're in a sort of more programming role, if you're kind of looking after more than just, delivery of a single team. I think those two, particularly the State of DevOps report, I've used that a couple of times in a couple of companies now, most recently at Zoopla, to help define a standard that we wanted to meet. So at Zoopla, one of the things we were really aware of is we knew we didn't want to be Google, right? We didn't need to be the best and the fastest and the best. We had to be the best at what we did. So that State of DevOps report really helped us figure out, good link, thanks James. That State of DevOps report really helped us figure out where did we want to fit in those rankings. And in actual fact, we ended up wanting to go for elite, and we got that reasonably quickly. But yeah, that really helps sort of place you into context. And even if you just talk to your team and you say, oh, what's our deployment frequency? What's our mean time to recovery? These are the kind of Dora metrics I mentioned. You can just get a sense of, well, how do I compare to the rest of the industry, or to, the elite leaders in the industry, or whatever, which might be a useful exercise.
Right. And sorry, I asked you earlier, what kind of level of awareness or understanding would you expect from an Agile coach? We've got this question that's kind of similar, but I think it's still worthy of its own call to you, actually. It's an anonymous one. Someone has said, what level of DevOps tools awareness is good enough for Agile coaches? So we talked about kind of awareness, but from a tools basis, do you have any views there?
I do, and it's not great. The world of DevOps tools has just been fragmenting from the minute we came up with the idea. I say we, I had nothing to do with it. The minute Patrick came up with the idea, the minute this movement started, that tool set's been fragmenting. I've done a lot of work in AWS over the years. I think the Amazon tool set's awesome. It's not perfect by any stretch. I can definitely point out some flaws, but just understanding, if you're in Amazon or Azure or GCP, just Googling Amazon, Azure, GCP, and then a word gets you something. So if you Googled AWS Secrets Manager, you could have a quick read of the blurb on Secrets Manager. And that first blurb isn't really aimed at engineering people, it's aimed at anyone to read. And then you can choose to go further. So the basic cloud providers will give you probably enough to get your head around the space. What they won't do necessarily is they won't help you figure out, well, how should I bundle those tools together to get the result I'm looking for? And that's super tricky. There's a lot of experience required in that, particularly if you're doing a React web app. Those are sort of the most complicated bits. There's so many moving parts to that. So what I guess my answer is, I wouldn't expect an Agile coach to have any knowledge of that tool set, because I'm frankly blown away when even engineers have a decent knowledge of that tool set. No insult to engineers, it's vast and enormous. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a consultant, because it lets me access and see so many different flavors of that stuff. I'm never bored because I'm always finding a new thing I have to play with. So what I would say is that the answer I gave earlier, where I talked about, as Agile coaches, if you really get to understand that process of going live and what that entails, and what the different services you'll need to interact with is, and all that kind of stuff, not at a technical level, but just a level to help people organize that stuff and organize their thinking around it, that will give you an insight into what are those tools you might use. And having done that once in a company, I would hope you would find you'd use the same tools again, unless your company is really crazy and it does lots of things different ways. So that would be what I would say. I don't expect it, but I think it's a really useful thing. If I went into an organization to do a bit of consulting, and I found an Agile coach or anybody in the delivery space who had a kind of working knowledge of what it meant to take an application live, and what sort of tools and systems and teams I might work with, I would be thoroughly blown away, and I'd be amazed, and that'd be an awesome place to work.
Great, thank you. I had a client earlier this year, and I'm going to embarrass myself here. You pronounced it very well. Is it Kubernetes?
I think it's Greek, right? So I don't do Greek very well, but okay. Kubernetes, I think, is the correct pronunciation. I didn't pronounce it right. So
an engineer at a client I was at passed me it was like a kid's storybook explaining what that is.
Oh, cool.
I can explain it like I'm 5, and it had the animals that wanted to get down the river to see their families. And do they use one boat or lots of different boats? And it was really, really, if it's helpful to anyone, I can try and dig that out. But as an ex-engineer, it was useful to me to kind of understand what they were kind of talking about, so I can kind of empathize with it. But, I'm not setting myself the expectation to be able to like take over an engineer's place and go lift up the lid and do it. I'll dig that out. I don't know if you're aware of that or any of those.
I would love to read that. That sounds awesome.
I'll have a dig at that. Great. We have been talking quite a bit. We're going to go till past, but I just want to give you an opportunity to have a glass of water or something nearby. I know I've been like on with you. I don't want you to dry out while we're doing that, and I'll just sort out my question and talk.
Appreciate it.
No problem. So, really good one here. How do you create an opportunity for buy-in from upper management that wants to still micromanage teams? E.g., we want you to teach the team this methodology.
I can't tell you that because that's the entire thing I trade off for my career. No, I'm kidding. So, man, I love and hate that question at the same time. So there's two aspects to that, I think, after a nanosecond's thought. You've got one aspect, which is that micromanagement thing. A productive, healthy team, in my humble opinion, is really product driven, right? So they're driven to deliver value. That's what matters to that team, right? And you would hope they have the autonomy to be able to decide for themselves with their product manager and you know, other associated team members and stuff, the right value to go after and the best way to do that, right? And you'd hope they have the information to do it. But I recognize, and one of the clients I do a little bit of work for definitely isn't in that space and definitely does make the call of do this and do that and do the other. And it is super difficult to work with that. And the bargaining chip I would use now, and obviously this changes, but this year it's very, very relevant, which is engineers have never been more in demand. You probably know for yourselves, everyone's having trouble hiring exactly who they want. There's a couple of factors in this. I won't go off down that tangent as to why, but it's true. And engineers are aware of this, right? They're feeling empowered by this. You know, the first question I get asked when I'm interviewing new engineers to work with 101 Ways is about remote working, because they'll only work remote now. You know, it's just a hard no for them if it involves going to the office and stuff. So I would be using a bargaining chip with leadership, which is good engineers want to have that autonomy and have that freedom to be able to make those choices with their product manager about what to go for. They don't want to be at the whim of somebody else, particularly somebody else who isn't as close to that application as they are. So the bargaining chip I would use to try and get a little more autonomy in that team, a little freedom to let them have some wiggle room would be that, which is we want good engineers to encourage them to come here. They must have the freedom to be able to make some of these decisions. There's an old management theory. I love this stuff, management theories. There's an old management theory called Theory X, Theory Y. It's probably out of date by now, but it's what I got taught at AOL the first time I became a manager and got my 2 days of management training, which is a luxury these days, 2 days of management training. Theory X, Theory Y kind of talks about the fact that some workers are, you know, well-educated, very intelligent, and some workers are not so educated and don't really want to make decisions, and that you have to treat those types of workers differently. And I think the theory is out of date because it typically talks about kind of, you know, assembly line workers versus, say, knowledge workers, whatever. But that was sort of how it started back in the sort of 60s and 70s. And the key point here is that everybody we hire into application development teams, whether they're software engineers or designers or exactly thinkers or doers, everybody we bring into teams that need kind of agile leadership, they're all thinkers. They're all people who want to be involved in that process. So treating them like they're doers is going to lead to that team decaying. So that's my first answer. My first answer is you want to create that freedom to allow this team to make the decisions it makes. The second answer, part of the answer is that freedom without constraints is terrifying for everybody, right? So one of the great things that things like DevOps can do is apply those constraints. So there's I've forgotten their name now. There's someone I met at a meetup a little while ago, and they work in a very regulated financial background, doing consultancy work. And they have this angle that the constraints placed by DevOps, so the infrastructure as code, the variables we choose, all that kind of stuff, are perfect for heavily regulated environments because you can audit every aspect of the process because it's there in code and in variables and what have you. So their big angle is meet your regulatory requirements by building the kind of DevOps capability that makes it enshrined in everything you do. So you can't publish manually. The developers don't even have access because they do it all through this pipeline, that kind of thing. So I would suggest that the two parts of this answer is, I would say, convince those leadership that you need to provide flexibility so you can get the engineers you need to get the job done, but also reassure that leadership with there will be adequate constraints. So whatever it is you're worried about something going wrong, we will build the constraints in there, whether it's you know, performance of the application for customers, and we build proper monitoring in, whether it's you're worried about some security concern, we build in proper encryption at rest and in motion, and we build proper constraints around who can access boxes, whatever that concern is. I think DevOps can provide the constraints that can help make senior management feel safe enough to allow teams to develop the autonomy they need in order to kind of meet their sort of value requirements. That's a really long-winded answer, but it's a tough question. So I defend myself.
No problem. Thanks very much. I just see Mickey has put his hand up. Is that in response to part of the answer? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes. By the way, Grant, it's great to hear you again. Okay, it really is. And I appreciate your answer. And with respect to what you're saying, I understand exactly what you're saying. And you probably don't remember me, but I teach Agile. I consult and coach Agile in Thailand, in the Thai language. Okay, and where my question is based upon is that the issue is in the Thai mentality, in the Asian mentality, is that the boss is king. Okay, and I consistently, even with the multinationals, like I've got 3 customers right now, and one of the companies is a German company that they have a development center here in Thailand, and where the issue I'm running into is the manager, the local manager here, the VP here, he's like, I'm the boss. You teach them this, and and then he goes on to manage, okay, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And I'm so open to what feedback you would have with mentality is where the manager says, well, you teach them to do this Agile thing, you teach them to do this, and then I'm going to tell them what I want to do. So any feedback, any insight that you would have in that context where the management is literally, you teach them this Scrum thing, you teach them this Agile thing, you teach them this DevOps, you teach them Lean. Okay, last week, Mickey, can you teach them some Lean? I'm like, sure, I can teach that. Okay, well, great. Well, let us know. And then they're like, well, okay, well, you need to do this. How would you address that?
Yeah, so I've seen that. I haven't worked with anybody from Thailand, but I have worked with teams in Singapore, and I saw a similar kind of mentality. I've also worked with teams in India, not quite the same thing, but certainly very, very aware of the sort of, contracts they'd kind of signed up to, right? And it was a different experience working with them than it was with working with people in the West. So I've had some success in this space. I don't want to tell you I've nailed it and I've written you a recipe or whatever, but certainly I've had some success. So again, partly to that answer I talked a little bit about earlier, one of the keys to this is that product value concept, right? If the manager is convinced that only they have insight into the right thing to do because the team can't possibly, there's an angle there that says, create opportunities for the team to demonstrate that they understand their space. So if it's an application, that interacts directly with users, create some space where that team can show that not only do they understand their metrics, but they also understand what that customer experience looks like. So I always think it's as with all these things, right? It's a little from column A, a little from column B. I think the leader has to become aware that they have people who work for them, who have brains and are thinking this stuff through and have a value proposition. And I think it's a bit of a journey, because I think stage 1 is, hey boss, I understand these users, I know what they want, I know what I have to do in terms of meeting Google's SEO requirements or whatever else we've got to meet. And then stage 2 is, and I understand the business context I'm operating in, so I know whatever targets we got to hit and what we have to optimize for and those kinds of things. And I think it's an opportunity to demonstrate those things. But that's not zero effort. And I totally appreciate that, right? If you've got a boss that's calling the shots, you've got to fill up every minute, every day with actions from that boss. Creating that space to embody that change is tough. And the same techniques exist for that, exist for everything, in terms of whenever we're trying to do any sort of transformation, The champion challenger model can be helpful, where you maybe hive off a tiny piece of your team to kind of go and prove one particular point. And I think it's one of those things that has a chain of dominoes in terms of, if you can get a small win, if you can demonstrate that, you know, this person in the team is really familiar with how this specific aspect works, and you can start getting input to that boss will start giving you some idea of, okay, what else would I be willing to accept input on? But again, these things don't exist in isolation, do they? You know, bosses who have this kind of micromanagement approach don't just sort of live in isolation. It's because there's other constraints on them. One of the things I remember from my days in AOL, when I was sort of getting a little mentoring on leadership, was something I haven't really seen elsewhere, but definitely was true in AOL, which was, if you were a director in AOL and you got stopped in the corridor and asked a question about something, you better have an answer. Like, it wasn't acceptable to go, I don't know, let me go check. You know, that would have been a bad failing. Like, this is something my mentor told me. It wasn't something I experienced. I wasn't a director at AOL, but I did observe it, and I definitely saw, you know, senior people with that perception. And so if this manager you're talking about is in an organization where, you know, if they get, you know, stopped in the corridor and they're expected to be able to give a definite answer, then the answer I'd give you is the kind of conversation I had with my boss at AOL, which was, what data can I give you? What dashboards can I give you? What can I make available so that you have this stuff, you know, at your fingertips? At what level do you think you want to give that answer? You know, like, you know, like I said, we were pretty mature at AOL. We had a lot of capabilities. I could have given my boss reams of data about every app, every service, every server, right? It was possible. But by finding that right level with him, I could make sure that he never got surprised. He was never not able to answer. And that culture we had fed back into the team, in that I could give my team a lot of freedom, and the freedom always went, you know, do what you know to be right, but make sure I know so I can back you up. If I don't know, I'm going to hang you out to dry. So yeah, that would be my approach. And sorry, it's again a long waffling answer, but I think you have to create an opportunity for your team to demonstrate that they have knowledge and capability in this space, and create a sort of empathic relationship with that manager to understand what conditions are they working, what kind of pressures, what's the expectations put on him that means he feels he needs to give this level of control. I mean, I'm sure there are people who love doing that micromanagement, but I've never really met anyone. I've really only seen people who do that as a defense mechanism. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying, you know, I haven't really seen anybody that just refuses to get out of the detail once they're allowed to. I hope that helps.
Thanks very much, Grant. We've got a little bit time for probably one or two more questions, but I want to focus more on the team level. I mean, a lot of the people tonight will be working with teams delivering things, and thankfully there's been a couple of really good questions from that perspective I want to put to you. So how do you organize Scrum teams on DevOps, and can they be cross-functional?
Hell yes, the best way is cross-functional. Sorry, I'm getting to the second part first because that's the bit I'm most passionate about. I'm a huge fan of cross-functional teams, particularly cross-functional teams that own their product from top to bottom, you know, so have the full insight into product value, how to deliver that value, etc. So if you have the opportunity to pull multiple skill sets into your team and have them work together, do it, because it's an amazing experience seeing people learn off each other and stuff and seeing what comes out of that. But I really think it delivers value faster than anything else. Sorry, I was about to witter on about an anecdote. You don't need to hear that. But so definitely cross-functional thing. As far as organizing Scrum teams around DevOps and stuff, yeah, going back to that answer I gave earlier, right? Your job generally in a Scrum team is you're building something that's going to get launched, right? I mean, maybe not in front of customers, maybe it's an internal customer, whatever, but either way, you're building something for a result. And it's very easy for engineers, particularly software engineers with a computer science background, it's really easy for them to get obsessed about the actual functionality they're building. And the reason for that is because the whole computer science degree is based around that. It's build the thing that you get told to build by your professor. But in computer science degrees, you very rarely take an application into production and run it against customers and deal with the implications of that. Whereas all of that is where the value comes from. And I often have this conversation with teams where I talk about how, while it feels like a lot of work to build something, you know, maybe it's a couple of years for a really big app or a game or something, it might live in production for 10 years. I've got an example, again, I talk about AOL a lot, right? I did this years ago, but one of the applications we sold to Carphone Warehouse when we split the AOL internet business off from the advertising business ran for 8 years after we sold it, and we'd been running it for 4. That's 12 years that thing lived in production for, right? And yeah, it took us 2 years to build it, but it ran for 12 years. So what I would encourage your team to think about, and for you to think about, is I'm not just building this thing, I got to run it, I got to make sure it, and the building is a cost. Once it's in production, it's an asset, right? It's accumulating revenue, I hope, or at least some other value for the business, right? So thinking about it in those terms, I think forming that team around the idea of, yeah, we got to build this thing, but actually we got to run it. We got to make sure it's good for years to really liberate the value to make it worth the investment we've put into it. And I think changing that conversation around to not just build it but run it, that gets you to DevOps, because you start thinking about deploying the thing, you start thinking about monitoring the thing, you start thinking about its value proposition in terms of how will I know it's got value, how do I know it's got revenue, etc. Is the best way to pull a team around. And I want to give you a little anecdote, at least from Electronic Arts this time, so at least I've spoken about a different company other than AOL. When we were publishing our games, the question I used to obsess over after I'd got used to publishing them was, how do I know it's working? As in, how do I know it's working well? And one of the guys in my team came up with this. The games we wrote were social games, right? So it's all about microtransactions, either in virtual currencies or real currencies. And what we realized was what it means to run a game well is that there are a healthy number of microtransactions. So we graphed them and we modeled them, and we said, all right, at this time of the day, we should be getting X many, at this time, Y many, at this time, Z many. And basically, we just stopped all monitoring and alerting of server metrics and all that stuff. And we just switched to monitoring the number of microtransactions we got. So we knew, for example, that there's a sort of 4 or 5 hour window while there's almost nobody on Earth awake as the sun moves over the Pacific. We get no microtransactions during that period of time, but they should start ramping up again a few hours later as the sun moves around the Earth, right? So that idea of really thinking about that value proposition actually meant that we could stop wasting a lot of effort monitoring stuff and testing stuff when what mattered was the transactions. So yeah, the way I would focus a team around DevOps is the complete value proposition, not just building, but launching it and running it and modifying it in production and updating it for whatever future requirements come, and focus the team on that as much as they're focused on building the thing in the first place.
Thanks very much, Grant. I've just got one more question. As an Agile coach, we're often asked, like, what's the simplest thing we can do to get started? And often we'll say, limit your work in progress, for example, because that is a killer. And I'm aware that many people tonight might be in organizations where DevOps is a totally new thing, or they've got a client who may be a little bit averse to going into that. So I wanted to ask you, what is the simplest thing that a team could start doing tomorrow or in the next few weeks or in the next month to help moving towards more of a DevOps approach?
The simplest thing is to be able to build your application locally on your laptop. So not even worrying about getting to production or monitoring or whatever, but if I can build this application on my laptop and test it myself, then I can very quickly find out if I've broken it and fix it, and very quickly get into that workflow of making small changes often and testing it really often. Coming back to the fact that at the core of DevOps is testing, right? You can't automate something unless you can test it, because otherwise you don't know if it's working. I think Bill Gates said something once about automating a bad process still means you have a bad process. It just happens faster, right? So for your team to get into the hang of building, deploying, testing, fast feedback, working together in a sort of distributed way, get it working locally. One of the most important things, and the things I think I'm proudest of the work we did at Zoopla, was one of the first requirements I had. Whatever we build, we're going to do it locally first, and you're all going to do it on your laptops, and we're going to know it works because you test it and you build it and you change it all the time. And we do that before we even deploy it on a server somewhere. That gave me two things. One, it gave me time to figure out how to deploy it onto a server. But the other thing was it got the teams used to this kind of workflow. So simplest thing you can do is, can you deploy it locally? Too many times I see applications that rely on, oh, well, it relies on 57 other applications, so I can't possibly run it locally. All right, mock those interfaces. Figure out what you have to do to make that run locally, because then you can get into that fast feedback loop. So if you try this, and if your team tell you, no, it won't work, relies on 27 other services, My answer is then, so your test environment is literally this and 27 other services. And they'll probably say yes, because at Just Eat, that's exactly what it used to be. QA environments used to be hundreds and hundreds of servers because of all the services we had to run. But we all knew that was the wrong thing. We knew the right thing would have been, I could have started it up. And yeah, there were lots of little mocks and stub applications I could use to make that thing fire up, even if it had external dependencies. Do that, and I think you will find that a lot of things will happen sort of organically from that point that will be better and will be faster.
Grant, thank you very much. That's our last question. I just want to thank you really, really sincerely for your generosity with your time and your thoughtfulness, being able to run everything with us tonight. Thank you very much.